Ivide varanenek valere santosham. It's really wonderful to be here in Kochi. I actually have a long history in this city. I got married here 16 years ago. My wife is from Kalur. Some of you may be familiar with her, Shanaz Habib. She actually translates some of Benjamin's novels, and she wrote a book that came out last year called Airplane Mode, which I highly recommend. It's better than my book, so take a look at it. But yeah, and even being here in Subhash Park is really special because years ago I used to take my daughter here to to play on the playgrounds here. So it's just really delightful to be back here in this completely different context.
Yeah, thanks Rollo for that really. Can you hear us at the back? Yeah, for that really wonderful introduction, and we're here in some ways to talk about the freedom of speech and expression. But I think the way to talk about it is through Rollo's really wonderful book called "I Am on the Hit List: Murder and Myth Making in South India." And I'm from Karnataka, and of course the book is really around the assassination of Gauri Lankesh. And it is, to my mind, it's a remarkable book because it picks up that moment of Gauri's assassination, looks into the past, as it were, as what made Gauri the really special person that she was, looks into the future in terms of what was the question of the justice or accountability for the killing of Gauri. So in many ways, I mean, many of us who are in Karnataka who actually knew Gauri, when initially we saw a book like with the title called I'm on the Hit List, I would have said, no, maybe I wouldn't really want to read it. We'll know everything that is in it, but that is not true at all. There's a lot of things I learned by reading the book about Gauri, her relationship to the city. What does justice mean as far as Gauri is concerned? But I think I'm getting a little ahead of the story. I'll leave Rollo to tell us a little bit more about who was Gauri Lankesh and how did he really get interested in this, in a sense, this life of someone who is actually a journalist in the Kannada press, in the Kannada medium, as it were, and somebody who is, in a sense, intensely local. And Rollo, of course, is intensely global, I would say, in terms of where he comes from. But his interest in Gauri and the fact that he wrote this book is really very moving as far as all of us in Karnataka, at least, who knew Gauri is concerned. But I'll leave it to really Rollo to tell us a little more about how you got interested in the story of Gauri Lankesh and who she was, for those of us who don't know her.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arvind. You know, I mean, the question of who was Gauri Lankesh is an incredibly complicated question to answer. It's a question whose answer changed so much over the course of her life. I mean, it changes for all of us over the course of our lives, but maybe even more so for hers. There were so many people who I met who were close to her who who knew her at different phases of her life and who seemed in some ways to be describing different people. You know, she went through many changes, and, I'm really grateful at how the book was received by people who knew her best, but I think if I was able to do justice to Gauri's very complex life, it's because there were so many writers who knew her so well, whose work I was able to build on, and not just about Gauri, but just about the entire world that I was trying to write about, And I really think of my book as one node in this vast constellation of books and writers, including yours, Arvind. Arvind's book, India's Undeclared Emergency, is in my bibliography and was an important book for me in understanding the political context of the past 10 years. And in a lot of ways, I just saw my book as an opportunity to synthesize in some ways, and also to build on the work of so many great Indian writers who are typically working under much greater pressure and threat than I will ever experience. And so, in a way, it's also writing this book as a chance to kind of leverage my own, relative safety to tell some of the stories and tell some of the truths that that a lot of Indian journalists and writers have been telling at a very high cost to themselves. As I said, I've been spending time in India for a long time, and my focus as a journalist has always been South India. I started coming here simply because I married a Malayali, and it was right around the time that I was beginning a freelance career as a journalist, and just immediately saw, coming here to Kerala especially, but then also more and more frequently visiting the neighboring states, that, this was not the India that I thought that I knew about from just reading about India in the New York Times. That, as everyone knows, India is a world unto itself, more comparable to a continent than to most other countries. And that, when I just immediately saw a chance for myself as a foreign journalist writing for a primarily American readership to write about this other part of the country that really was getting ignored mostly in the American media. Most foreign correspondents in India are based in Delhi. If they report outside of Delhi, it's usually pretty close by, and maybe a southern story here or there once or twice a year. And I really wanted to immerse myself in this place and try to just share my excitement for what a particular place it is in the world and what a special place it is in the world. And so that's really been kind of my mission these past years. Yeah.
Thanks, Rollo. I think if you read the book, you'll get a sense that Gauri was the last person who was assassinated in a chain which begins from Dabolkar, then Pansare, then Kalburgi, and finally it's Gauri. And the list includes, again, I'm on the hit list. The list includes Girish Karnad and Bhagwan and Manu Bhagwan as well. So it's really a list of intellectuals of South India who are targeted to be killed. What the book is very important, which we don't know much about, is exploring the ecosystem of the right wing. And there is a way in which we know, of course, we know the RSS, we know the BJP, we know the Bajrang Dal, we know the VHP, these are names we're familiar with. But the killings are linked to an organization called the Sanatan Sanstha and the Hindu Jagran Vedike. So the way most Indians understand the right wing is RSS is a organization of many heads, and the organizations I mentioned now are all parts of that the various heads, as it were. But where do you think something like Sanatan Sanstha, which seems to believe expressly, overtly and clearly in the question of violence outside the framework of law, where does that fit within this ecosystem of the right? Again, why this is such a great book is Rollo actually interviews and meets people from the organization, which none of us would be able to do quite as easily. So he really builds, again, as an ally, as a fellow thinker, who's able to give us a sense of the ecosystem of the right wing. Could you give us a sense of where does this thing of murder and killing come from, and how do these organizations link to the wider ecosystem of the right wing?
Yeah, thank you. And here too, I'm definitely not painting this picture from scratch. I'm very indebted to the work of numerous journalists, Indian journalists, who have been studying these so-called fringe groups, especially Dhirendra Jha, whose book Shadow Armies was just an essential text for me, but who also very generously answered my questions by email when I had them while I was writing this book. And the question of how they fit into this ecosystem is really interesting because it's very relevant to my own political context back in the U.S., where you've got these this really diverse constellation of right-wing groups, from these kind of stodgy establishment groups, ranging all the way to these groups on the fringe who are willing to do violence and thuggery and who are willing to take really extreme and sometimes shocking positions, but they're all part of this same interconnected ecosystem of right-wing politics. And it's to understand these ecosystems is becoming more and more urgent in my country. In fact, we should have been doing the homework of understanding this ecosystem decades ago. Now we're playing catch up, and it's a little too late. But the Sanatan Sanstha, the group that the conspirators who killed Gauri, and of course the three writers who preceded her. Their position's very interesting. They're not technically a part of the Sangh Parivar, and but they're still part of the same network in another way. They host a huge annual convention every year in Goa that's around building a Hindu Rashtra. And it attracts a lot of Sangh Parivar groups. And in fact, the year before he was elected prime minister, 2013, Narendra Modi sent a letter of congratulations to the Sanatan Sanstha for their Hindu Rashtra convention, with his regrets that he couldn't be there. And so it's interesting. At other times, though, when these groups like Sanatan Sanstha say incredibly outrageous things, use genocidal language against Muslims, for example, at this conference, they'll then distance themselves. And it's this dance, of embracing and distancing. And these fringe groups are really useful in that way, that they can open the window for what's permissible to say. They can test the margins of what's permissible to say. Not just permissible to say, but what's permissible to do. Because as you alluded, these groups are often quite violent. But then pull back and kind of use it as a meter for how far you can go at any given moment.
Rollo, you want to reflect a little bit on what is so specific about this group in particular and this chain of assassinations. Again, we know that Dabholkar and Pansare are atheists, and they believe that in rationalism, Kalburgi is someone who challenges the fundamentals that Lingayats puts forth the idea that Lingayats is a separate religion. They don't form part of the Hindu fold. And Gauri, of course, is a journalist who takes on the right wing in every way. So what do you think brings these four together, and why do you think they targeted these four people in particular? Again, we are very used to the question of violence against minorities. That's a part of the everyday. But this question of targeting intellectuals, writers, thinkers is something which is quite new, even within the ecosystem of the right wing. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking of what accounts for that reason? Why did they target these intellectuals and thinkers in particular?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because it does, in some ways, kind of break the pattern of targeting minorities. And in fact, that was very deliberate and explicit. That's something that came out in the investigations. A lot of detail came out of these investigations. And, in the case of the first two victims in this pattern, Dabholkar and Pansare, it was a little more clear why Sanatan Sanstha would target them. And again, Sanatan Sanstha has never taken direct responsibility for these things. The men who conspired, there were ultimately 19 men charged for conspiring to kill Gauri Lankesh, and all of them had some kind of affiliation with Sanatan Sanstha. Some of them very, very close lifelong affiliations with Sanatan Sanstha, but before they took on these murders, they distanced themselves. They, supposedly quit the organization and this sort of thing. But it was very clear why Sanatan Sanstha would have a beef with Dabholkar and Pansare. Dabholkar was constantly going toe-to-toe with them over, he was promoting an anti-superstition law in Maharashtra. The Sanatan Sanstha was the chief opponent to that law, so they were constantly arguing. They were actually frequently issuing threats to him publicly. So that was clear. Similar with Pansare. with Kalburgi and with Gauri, it became a little murkier. Now we're in a different state in Karnataka, where at that time Sanatan Sanstha was pretty minor. They weren't doing much there. Unfortunately, that's actually changed over time. The infamy of this case of the assassination of Gauri Lankesh has actually increased their influence. And now Sanatan Sanstha is bigger than ever in Karnataka. They've only grown as a result of the notoriety that they've achieved from this case. But in that case, it's very interesting. It seems to be that in both the case of Kalburgi and Gauri Lankesh, that they zeroed in on very specific things that they said in single speeches, and among most of the conspirators, they seem not to even have heard of Kalburgi or Gauri Lankesh before taking on these assassinations. Both of them, as you point out, they were local figures. M.M. Kalburgi was, probably the most important scholar of Kannada of his time, but very little known outside of Karnataka. And similar with Gauri Lankesh, she was not a national figure. She was writing in Kannada. And so why would they go out of their way to another state, to another language, target these two people who are actually not that famous? And interestingly, it seems to have to do with this idea of blasphemy, that both of them had said things that could not be tolerated, even if they only said them once, that they transgressed what was possible to say so far that they could not be permitted to live. It's very interesting because it's actually a new idea, because there is no ancient history of a concept of blasphemy in Hinduism. It's just not there. And so it's a very modern idea. It seems to be an idea that was ironically borrowed from the Abrahamic religions that, these fringe Hindutva groups take on as their primary enemy. So in a weird way, it seems to be this kind of mirroring of the enemy, this obsession with blasphemy that's kind of come out of nowhere in recent years. And so they targeted these two, and then, but then they took no responsibility for it. It's a very interesting thing too, where their motivations were very murky. Even now we can only guess at their full motivations because, actually, the journalist T.J.S. George, who passed recently, wrote a fascinating essay about this in the context of Gauri Lankesh. That in the old days, assassins in India took immediate credit for the people who they killed because they wanted to send a message, and they wanted that message to be very clear. Naturam Godse famously, gave a long, and actually eloquent speech, in the courtroom, and which was published as a book, explaining his motivations. And now assassins just do their work and disappear and leave. When Gauri Lankesh was killed, no one had any idea why. There were a dozen different theories. The right wing was just one of many, And so it's an interesting, but part of it, I think, is this very deliberate ambiguity. And this is kind of a new thing. I think this is a new thing that authoritarians have learned, is the importance of ambiguity. Well, the title of your book, India's Undeclared Emergency. In many ways, the situation that we find ourselves in now and the situation during Indira Gandhi's emergency is quite similar. Probably the key difference is the undeclared nature of it. That, there was one journalist who told me where we were talking about suppression of the press in India, and the comparison he made was that, during the emergency, the censor had a face. You knew the censor was telling you they were censoring. They weren't trying to hide it. It was very direct. Now, they don't declare, they just do. And it leaves them room to deny later, or just to gaslight you and make you believe that it's not happening. And they've got plenty of eager messengers to try to also convince you that what you see with your own eyes is not happening. And, the fact that, this organization that killed these 4 writers, they deliberately didn't have a name. And everything is very intentionally murky, and I think that's a big lesson that the current generation of authoritarians has learned globally.
Thanks, Rollo. The other question which I had is really the entire question of what is the possibility of justice. And again, we know that after the assassination of Gauri, again, the three people who were assassinated before her, but there were no, again, please correct me if I got this right or wrong, but there were no arrests made. After Gauri's assassination, there's an investigation which resulted in arrests. Again, why this is so significant and so important is the hit list included both Girish Karnad and Manu Bhagwan. They'd have been next on the list. And if you didn't stop them, there would have been other people as well. There were 100, I think, on the list itself. So the fact that the arrests happened was of great significance. And Rollo goes in great detail into the question of the investigation itself. And perhaps you want to tell us a little bit of what was so important of the investigation of Gauri's killing, and why was that so different from the previous killings?
Well, it really did break the pattern. You know, the first three murders, the investigations went nowhere. They were a total shambles, you know. I mean, probably, and yeah, there were very few arrests. When there were arrests, it was tended to be the wrong people. Sometimes in an apparent police attempt to cover up their inability to find the right people. And lots of time wasted. I mean, probably the worst example was in Narendra Dabolkar's case. The Maharashtra police actually enlisted a spirit medium who claimed that he could bring Dabolkar's spirit back to tell them who murdered him. It was actually a former policeman who reinvented himself as a spirit medium, and which was obviously horribly ironic given Dabolkar's lifelong anti-superstition campaign. And the evidence that came out of this seance was not actionable and did not lead to any. It just wasted a lot of time. And so by the time, you know, and this pattern repeated with each of the next murders, each investigation seemed to go nowhere. And so when Gauri was killed, and then it was pretty obvious that it was part of the same pattern, her friends were understandably very cynical about the prospects of this investigation and assumed that it too would go nowhere. So it was actually a big surprise when a few months later they, you know, arrested 18 people. Well, it took a year or so to arrest the full 18. One is actually still absconding, the 19th man. But yeah, and then not just the fact that they arrested these men, but seemed to have reams of evidence. You know, there was a 9,000-page charge sheet, which I went through in a lot of detail. I had to get a lot of it translated, which is a whole other story. But yeah, they, you know, for whatever reason, the special investigation team into Gauri's murder, which at one point had hundreds of police officers assigned to it, just did a really professional job. But then you've got the trial. And, you know, these arrests were primarily made in 2018. The trial began in 2022. And it is still going on with no end in sight. And some witnesses are starting to turn hostile. It meets for a maximum of 5 days a month. I mean, who can even remember what happened in 2017 now? So the prospect of well, you asked the question of justice, and of course, as you know, it's such a complicated answer. Like, is there going to be? Will the perpetrators face justice? I'm increasingly doubtful. They're all out on bail now. They've been felicitated, as is the current custom, as soon as they came out. But at least the pattern was stopped, as you note, and the killings have not continued.
I'll just read what Rollo has to say on this in the book. He says criminal justice systems are not primarily about guilt or innocence. They're about how one manages to navigate an enormously complex and opaque system, either by skill or by luck, and how much navigational assistance one can access or afford. In India, the system's disconnect from guilt or innocence is even starker than most. Due to the abuses of the police and the sluggishness of the courts, the worst punishments, torture, imprisonment, are largely meted out long before a verdict is even delivered. So keeping that perspective in mind of your, I think that's why I think the idea of justice, I think is very, very important in your book. And again, why this is such a remarkable book is Rollo doesn't stop with the idea of justice and the criminal justice system. It's obviously very vital and very important in terms of, as he rightly indicated, the killing stopped because arrests happened. If that arrest had not happened, Manu Bhagwan or the next person would have been killed. And so that's just shocking and chilling when you think about how important it is that the system functions. But there's another idea of justice, I think, in the book, which is the idea, links back to the idea of literature and art and the question of remembering and how one remembers who Gauri Lankesh was. And that's why the book is so remarkable, because it goes from the nuances and the details of the criminal justice system to really mapping out the ecosystem of resistance within which Gauri was a very, very important actor. And post that, I think you also document that of how people have sought to keep the memory of Gauri alive. And that's maybe another gesture towards justice. Justice as remembrance. Justice as a gesture towards the future. And do you want to tell us a little bit about that part of your notion of justice?
Well, this aspect of the book of trying to track and understand Gauri's life, I mean, just for me personally, was the most important part of the book. That this was actually what sustained me over writing a book of this nature over years, was the questions that Gauri's life raised for me just about how to live a life, and that she lived such a remarkable life and such a multifaceted life and such an inspiring life in so many ways, that it really changed my thinking, and it really changed my life. It changed the way I approach journalism. It changed the way I think about the relationship between journalism and activism, and the relationship between journalism and just being a political person. And it also just, it really profoundly changed my view towards friendship. And that's very much inseparable from the political part. For Gauri, it was all one and the same, the political life and the rich life of friendship. And that she really understood in this deep way that to be a good friend is a political act, And honestly, seeing just the extraordinarily rich way that she approached friendship, and just the incredible talent that she had for friendship, just the way that so many people who I met who loved her talked to me about how she was so often the only person who was there for them, So many people told me this, that she would be as busy as she was, how much pressure she was under, how much financial pressure she was under. She had virtually no money at all. She sold her life insurance policy the week before she was killed in order to pay the salaries of her of the employees at her newspaper. So, and she never stopped working. She never took a break, and somehow still had time to cultivate deep friendships all over the country. And it really made me look at my own life and realize how much I'd sort of abandoned, the work that goes into friendship, and how I really needed to correct that before I die, And there were so many ways in which her, yeah.
I'll just read again from Rollo's book on 2 paragraphs on why Gauri mattered so much to him and really matters so much to all of us. Her great talents were those that don't come with job titles. A talent for friendship, a talent for outrage, a talent for mentorship, a talent for cultivating local thoughts, as one friend put it, in the face of the growing movement to homogenize Indian culture. The extraordinary variety of people who came out to protest her murder revealed another unappreciated talent, the ability to align in common cause disparate interest groups that otherwise agitated on separate tracks. We actually didn't realize the space she filled, one activist told me. Now we see that no one is ready to fill that space. I'll get one more paragraph on again, Rollo's talked about what Gauri meant to him. In terms of Gauri's writing, again a very beautiful paragraph on Gauri's writing. He says, when writing against politicians or religious nationalists, Gauri was strident and jeering. When writing in praise of her comrades, she was sincere and affectionate. When writing in defense of the oppressed, she was anxious and tender. When writing about herself, she was invariably self-deprecating. Regardless of subject, she was direct and frank and unpretentious and never lyrical abstract. The little evidence of craft, she knew she was not a poet. No one thought that her Kannada columns would someday be translated and published as important documents as they're being done today, her friend Pushpa Mawala noted. So I'll take from this 2 points, Rollo. One is the why this book is so important is very often you read a book which is very weighty and very difficult. You can go back feeling very depressed and very low. But that is not the sentiment you go back after reading this book. You go back with a feeling that there is in some sense an ecosystem of resistance, the people who think differently, the people who act differently in spite of very difficult circumstances. And Gauri is one of them. There are many other names which fill this book. And one of the figures you really draw on is again Gauri's father, who is a very important journalist in Karnataka called P. Lankesh. And Rollo goes quite in detail into his life. And again, for those who are not from Karnataka, which I guess a lot of people here, and even those from Karnataka, not many people know Lankesh because people are born within more English-speaking milieu. They don't really know Lankesh. So again, I'm very happy to see Lankesh's work and life really foregrounded in this book. Do you want to speak a little bit about Gauri's relationship to her father and what she took from her father and how she took some parts of his courage forward in her own work and her own life?
Yeah, sure. It was great fun to be able to dig into the life of Gauri's father. He was just like Gauri, he was just a one-of-a-kind person. And he was an absolute giant of Kannada literature. But yeah, not well known outside of Karnataka because very little of his work has been translated. He wrote in pretty much every form, short stories, plays, journalism, of course, because he founded the paper Lankesh Patrike that Gauri eventually took over. And he was just a wild guy. There was this real streak of punk rock in him. He was completely unpredictable, an absolute genius with words, irascible. At one point, one of his longtime, deputy at the paper, Lankesh had impulsively fired his whole staff, and except his deputy, and then he said, "Oh well, don't worry about it. I'll just write the entire next issue," and then he knocked it out. And he would write under multiple pseudonyms in the paper, and no one even knew that all these pseudonyms were him because he had this incredible ability with just all the local idioms of Kannada from all around the state and from among many different communities. Just this really rare talent that's obviously incredibly difficult to capture in translation. But the funny thing was, Gauri also didn't really know her father's work until she took over his paper because she wasn't fluent in Kannada. Even at the time, so he died, kind of unexpectedly in the year 2000. I mean, it should have been expected because of the amount that he drank and smoked, and he was just a complete bacchanalia with P. Lankesh all the time. So he was not in great health. But it was unexpected when he died in the year 2000. And there'd been no thought of who would take over. And this paper, Lankesh Patrike, it was so fun to hear people talk about it in Karnataka, because it was like they talked about it like it was just the greatest paper that had ever been published. Just this unclassifiable mix of high and low and sensationalism and high-mindedness, all just mixed together with his just completely idiosyncratic sensibility. And people would just wait all week for the next issue to come out, and they'd all get sold out from the newsstand right away. And so just this huge figure, but there was no talk about succession, when he died. And so when he did die, they just thought they were going to close the paper down. But then someone said, well, who's going to pay the staff? Like, they have outstanding salary. We have to at least keep it going for a little while. And then very unexpectedly, they settled on Gauri, which was not what anyone thought would be the outcome, including her, not least because, as I said, she was not fluent in Kannada, the language of the paper. So that was a big obstacle. A lot of people were understandably very skeptical of that, but she really rose to the occasion and became fluent in Kannada in a short time, to the point where within a couple of years she was proofreading and catching errors that other people made. And she never became, like in the passage that I read, she never became, fluid and literary with it, but she wasn't trying to be. Her ex-husband, said that she wrote in this kind of like rough street Kannada, and I don't think she would have had it any other way. That's how she liked to communicate, And but in the process of learning Kannada, finally as an adult, and then also just wanting to be true to the legacy of her father's paper, she started actually reading his work for the first time. And really, and it's really fascinating to read. She writes many essays about her own experience of discovering his work, and not even just his work, discovering her own city and discovering her own state and her own culture through this language that she didn't have access to before. It's really beautiful.
Thanks, Rollo. I think we'll run out of time, but I'll make one last comment. The book is also, as you can see, it's many things. The other thing the book is, in my own opinion, is also a love song to Bangalore. And for those of you who know Bangalore, you'll think of it more in terms of traffic. And Rollo begins the book with talking about traffic. But this is something beyond traffic. He looks at the bookshops in Bangalore, looks at the literary culture in Bangalore, looks at the way in which the activist cultures in Bangalore, and a range of really beautiful things which it brings to light. In fact, colleagues and friends from Bangalore often make the point that it's so wonderful when someone from outside looks at the city from another lens. You learn something about your own city through that way. So thanks for that to Rollo. And one last point I'll end with, which is, if you, Hannah Arendt has a really marvelous book called Men in Dark Times. And she begins that book saying, sometimes even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some light. The light that we expect may not often come from concepts and theories, but may come from the lives that some people lead. And their lives, in the time that is given to them on earth, sometimes will give you more light than concepts and theories, as it were. Whether the light is the light of the sun or the light of the candle, only the future will tell. And I think the book, in a sense, is about that. It's about shedding that light through one life. And what the light is, the future will tell us. But thank you so much, Rollo, for really casting that light, which we hope to take forward in our work in the future. Thank you again for this.
Thank you so much, Arvind. That was lovely. I really appreciate it.
We have time to take one question from the audience.
Better make it a good one.
This is more of a clarification. Did you mean K.S. Bhagwan, who is a Mysore-based rationalist, or Banu Bhagwan, who's an academic in the U.S.?
K.S. Bhagwan, yeah. K.S. Bhagwan, who's always been willing to say the most outrageous things. But it's interesting, like, K.S. Bhagwan says completely outrageous things about Hinduism, about Hindu gods. A lot of it is really, you can understand why people are offended by it. He's going out of his way to provoke. But he makes the point, people were saying this stuff in decades past, and they weren't getting murdered for it, I mean, Periyar was saying just as outrageous things as K.S. Bhagwan ever said, and he lived to be a ripe old age. So that it is a big shift.
You can take one more question.
Yeah, sure, please.
You know, one of the people that Gauri mentored, in the short time that they were able to intersect before she was killed and he went to jail, was Umar Khalid. And he was really, I mean, he was devastated by her assassination. And I think that, I don't know if that's in your book, but that friendship really speaks volumes about, you know, where she stood with regards to the question of, you know, our civil liberties and freedom of speech and democratic rights and so on, and the state of minorities.
Yeah, no, I do write about Umar Khalid in the book.
Can I
Yeah.
add one this thing? And how is this resistance ecosystem in Karnataka and in Bangalore after post Gauri? I would like to know, as a Malayali journalist, how has this Gauri Lankesh thing affected? Has it enriched the resistance ecosystem, or has it silenced it, made it weak? Thank you.
Yeah, both great questions. Yes, I do write about Umar Khalid in the book, and I mean, nothing breaks my heart more in India now than Umar Khalid's continued imprisonment on preposterous charges of leading a pogrom against his own community. It's insane, it's outrageous, and it's just hard to take that it just continues. Yeah, the question of, you know, resistance and dissent in Bangalore after Gauri, I think it's really complicated. I mean, I think it's really gone in both directions. And that's, sorry, am I losing the mic? I mean, this is just something that I learned from speaking to so many of her friends and colleagues, is that they told me directly, some of them felt, well, like including Prakash Raj, you know, the actor who's actually speaking right now at a different venue. He's spoken often about how just Gauri's murder just kind of almost against his will compelled him to speak out in a way that he never had before, a degree and with a frequency he never had before. And there's others who told me, quite frankly, like, I've, you know, receded to the sidelines now because my family is worried for my life, and so I don't actually go on television anymore and speak forthrightly because it's too frightening. And I absolutely respect that fear, you know. So I really think it's gone in both directions with many people. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Romig. Thank you, Mr. Narrain.